Ready? Okay. Marsh is Women in History Month. Tonight we're going to be doing something on women and their impact on the history of the automobile. Before I start, when you go through the museum, there are the wall murals outside, everything in the 20s. Everything else was done by Vicky Goodhart. Downstairs in the lower level, we had the diner with Flo Fortney ran for a number of years. If you look at those folks and the people we're going to be talking about this evening, nobody here did this so they'd be in the history books. They did it because they saw a need, filled it, wanted a job, did it, and I guess for some, it was just for the adventure as far as racing, things like that. Most of what you are going to hear tonight is information I gathered at the AACA library across town. If you're doing any kind of research on automobiles, it's a public library. It is not a lending library. You cannot take anything out. In 1886, Carl Benz invented the car. Actually, back then, they didn't know what to call it. This was in Germany. It was a three-wheel bike-like vehicle. One summer day in 1888, his wife, Bertha Benz, pushed the vehicle out of earshot of her sleeping husband and proceeded to take it on a trip, thus becoming the first woman in the world to drive a car. She did a 16-mile trip. The highway that she went on today is named in her honor. This trip would have been a 2-day affair if they'd been horse and buggy. In America, we lag behind Europe in car development. Duray started in 1893. It is the first company given credit for producing cars. In 1896, they produced 13 cars that were all built the same. While many other companies came and went, Cadillac, Ford, and Buick are also left of the cars that were started in the 1902, 1903 time period. Our roads also lag behind Europe roads, and that's a subject for another day. In 1899, Louise Hitchcock Davis, a young reporter, went with her husband John in a National Duray on a trip that was going to take them from New York City to the West Coast. They quietly disbanded in Chicago with a litany of breakdowns. Louise wrote of their many breakdowns and shortcomings in a lighthearted manner that inspired early designers to make rugged, reliable cars. As you go through the museum, look at the cars and without touching them, think of how you would fit in. The very early ones were primitive. It was an experimental time. They were open, but they were kind of small. Experimental in that one used wood for brakes, since the wagons all did that. The other one tried woven camel hair, which in a word probably scared me about the second time you hit the brakes. The brush we have here has a wooden front axle. It was something that somebody tried, evidently it didn't work. Closer to home, back in the 1906, 1908 time period, down in Dillsburg, some guy worked on a car. He probably didn't have his wife look at what he was doing. When you turn left, the car went right. Some relative borrowed the car and promptly put it on somebody's porch. Around the turn of the century, a lot of things were happening in here, and here are some of them. In 1900, female drivers were on the streets of New York City. As a side note, in some parts of the world, women are forbidden for driving. While we were driving down to Mexico City in 1960, I was a backseat driver. We did not see any females on the road at all. Miss Julian Bracken, secretary by trade, becomes the first woman licensed to drive in Chicago in 1900. Also in 1900, a 17-year-old girl challenges any woman to a race. And here I thought this is something that guys did. If you look at some of our early cars, they have a gear on the inside of either the left or the front wheel where you can hook up a speedometer. And all things aside, if you're going to race, you might as well find out how fast you're going. Another first was Jeanette Nenstrom, who was at the age of 13, said to be the first female licensed driver in 1900. Driving must be a good thing. In Chicago, a woman takes an exam so she can teach other women to drive. This is in the 1900s. On that, I guess if you can drive them, you can also sell them. Can't be far behind. In 1901, the first woman agent, basically the same as a dealership today, receives her first load of cars, depending on the make. When they were unloaded at the train depot, some of them had to be basically assembled. And then either the dealer or the salesperson had to teach a new person, the new owner, how to drive it so they could get on home. Mrs. Miles Baird is the first woman passenger to enter Yosemite in an automobile through a Chinese camp in Big Oak Flats in 1901. Several years ago, I had done some research on this area. In 1872, it was hard to get a stagecoach through. By 1901, probably had not changed very much. Mrs. Marie Kuhn becomes the operator of a car in 1901. It's kind of like, so what? She was 93 years old. Keep in mind, while the car was catching on with both sexes, there were people who just never drove. My granddad was born in 76. In the words of my dad, he never touched the wheel. Next up is a radio quiz question. Who invented the windshield wiper? This comes up, I've heard it on the radio more than once. In 1902/3, Mary Anderson did. It was patented by late 1903. In a life that stretches from 1866 to 1953, wipers were only one of her accomplishments. She was a real estate developer, a rancher, and on the side she studied grapes, so she may have had a winery of some sort. Prior to this, a mixture of onion and carrot juice was smeared on the windshield, and to keep the windshield clear in rainy weather. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that during the summer it probably wasn't too ripe either. Anderson, while riding in a streetcar, came up with this idea of a wiper to be operated from inside the car. Looking at our collection of early cars, notice that a number have an overhang over the windshield. In a light rain, you're safe. If you have a driving rain, there's a split between the top and the bottom windshield. You can open up a crack. You can still see out. You're going to get wet, but you'll be able to see out. On the cars where they had the hand lever, I've talked to a number of guests here who've talked about when they were kids, while Dad was driving like a Model T, their job would be to stand there beside him, this far from the windshield, and doing this number. Vacuum and electric wipers took over this task. She let her patent expire. In 1905, she tried to interest a Canadian firm in her idea, who did not see any commercial value in it. Wipers became standard in 1916. In 1903, an article, after mystery clears up, rather simple process of driving, easier shopping. Think about this, the car can be parked for periods of time and without having to concern yourself with a horse. Another article in 2003 of a woman who takes 15-minute instruction and then with a little practice, puts her kids in, straps them in, and goes for a ride. In 1908, the girl in the motor came out by Hilda Ward. She was about 30 when she wrote this. It tells about her experience as a woman driver and an auto mechanic in the early years of the automobile. This is still available as a reprint on Amazon. Joan Cuno became an early race car driver in 1908 until women were banned from racing. I guess the honest truth is here is that men got tired of getting beat. She drove a white automobile in the 1905 Gleason tour, becoming sidelined when crashing to avoid another car, and literally ditching the car into a creek. The car in front hit its brakes, but they had no brake lights. So by the time she realized it was too late. Alice Ramsey, who I think a lot of people have heard about, takes up the challenge in 1909, driving to Maxwell and 3 female friends 3,800 miles across the country. Maxwell Briscoe and Company kept her in supplies of tires and parts. Her husband never learned to drive, but did seem happy to supply her with a new Maxwell every so often. Ramsey was about 22. One of her friends was somewhere between 16 and 19, depending on whose account you listen to. The other two women were her husband's sisters, and her husband was about 20 years older than she was, and these ladies were also. Maxwell is the car that Jack Benny made famous in his radio, I guess, early TV things. His Maxwell was melted down for the war effort. By 1910, 5% of the drivers on the road were women. Sometimes you can squeeze a lot into 1 year. In 1910, Blanche Stewart Scott had an eventful year. She's being credited with the first woman to fly an airplane, accidentally. She was in the cockpit, I guess playing with the controls, and the plane had been tethered down, and something broke. Next thing, there she was up in the air and flew about 40 feet high and landed it successfully. Then to top this off, she and her maid drove a 1910 Overland across the country. The Overland was equipped with a built-in wardrobe trunk and a toilet was added in Medicine Bowl, Wyoming. The trip was from Overland dealer to dealer, so for advertising purposes, and I'm assuming if you had a breakdown, there was some way there to help you out. She followed Alice Ramsey as only the second female driver to cross the country and the first to go from New York to San Francisco. In 1912, Cadillac introduces the electric start. We have a 12 Cadillac here on the lower level. Start by Charles Kettering, changing how women can interact with the vehicle, making the quiet, clean electric cars not so desirable with their short distance. The steamer, with its slow startup time and hassle factor, falls slowly out of favor. Now women have new freedoms of movement not seen before. Downstairs, like I mentioned, we do have a Cadillac on display. When the stagecoaches were still being used in 1913, a woman starts a passenger and freight line somewhere between San Angelo and Sonora out in Arizona, a distance of 70 miles. One of her vehicles was a 20-passenger bus. In 1913, an Omaha, Nebraska woman invents a product she uses on her own car. It's probably a nice way of saying she probably only sold about 2 or 3 of these. If someone looks like they're about to get hit, she pushes the pedal on the floor, the neck comes off, it's hooked to the front bumper, folds out, looks like a Hershey Bears hockey net, and catches the people. And the question comes up is, why didn't she just hit the brakes? Well, the brakes back then were just on the rear wheels. They weren't very good. If they got wet, they were even worse. Salad film star Florence Lawrence, I kind of like that name. At one time, the highest paid film star ever. She's been surpassed lately. I missed a line. But then she started a mechanical signaling arm in 1914, and it was not patented. Lawrence also designed the first mechanical brake signal. Her mother, Charlotte Bridgewood, in 1917, had a manufacturing plant and came up with the automatic windshield wiper that used a roller instead of wipers. Well, my financial failure, it did harbor things to come, be electrically driven. The way I understand it, the stop sign, when she pulled something up on the dash, a little stop sign came up and said stop. This is before they had put electric to it. An article in this same time frame also talks about the high-end vehicles as far as some of the better things in life. Maxwell was employing women in sales and as demonstrators, promising the same pay as men in 1914. This was the same year that Henry Ford came up with his $5 a day for qualified employees working 8-hour shifts. Ford had another bent on it. He was doing this so he would have less turnover on his shop floor. Anita Kane, another film star, drove a Kissel car across the country in 48 days in 1915. She enjoyed racing and driving her own stunt cars while filming. In 1915, Amanda Prius, while awaiting an award from Oldsmobile, practicing on a Brand X, they didn't mention what kind it was, breaking her arm, had to have it set twice before taking a trip in 1916 in an Oldsmobile V8 Roadster with 11 days. In 1916, were you ever a Girl Scout? Okay. In 1916, the Girl Scouts started an automobile badge. Girls had to demonstrate driving skills, auto mechanics, and a first aid to achieve it. The cover on the 1917 Motors Manual, following the trends of the day, has a female police officer directing traffic. In 1919, to show that it wasn't just a woman with name recognition or money in the bank, my late mother-in-law drove a non-driving school superintendent from various schools up in New Hampshire. She was 10 years old at the time. Things of this nature were happening all over the country. In the 1920s, bigger engines gave us bigger enclosed cars, bit boxy, but some style was coming in. In 1921, Miss Marie Lubering designed some parts for a Mack truck, becoming the first woman member of the Society of Automotive Engineers. She liked to draw and used her ability there. Article in 1921 mentions that that women want appearance and comfort, don't care about mechanics. In the 1912 to 22 period, there's an article in Wheels magazine, which is an AACA publication from '94. 5,000 plus women are granted patents. What makes this even more amazing is that this was before they had the right to vote. So getting a patent was very hard to do. Some were for correcting design problems they saw driving the cars. Other ones for covering carburation, clutches, brakes, bumpers, tires, even traffic control in the big cities. This is before they had traffic lights. They also worked on things like child restraints. Kate Gleason becomes the first female member of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in 1922. Had her dad perfect a gear cutting machine that he'd been working on, and then she made a very good living selling the parts. Even with the hard times of the Depression, cars became more stylish with softer body lines. Some took on Art Deco styling. When you're going through the museum, take a look at the buildings in the 1930s. That's some of the Art Deco design. DeSoto had a beautiful Art Deco design dash. In 1937, Chrysler hired Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf, to advertise the Chrysler products as being smooth riding. Just as the 1940s were underway, we were interrupted with World War II. So what you saw before the war is what you saw after the war. Good solid cars. If you have a chance, do check out the Tucker display down there. Women filled in for men in gas stations as mechanics and made war materials for the war. During World War II, basically in 1944, North Carolina, the world's largest school bus fleet of 5,000 buses, stated since using females from 16 to 18 years of age, they had experienced 40% less repairs, 20% less for fuel. America was on the move in the 50s with styling that may have been over the top. In 1952, Dorothy Draper, hired by Packard to spruce up the interior of the cars, she was also mentioned in their advertising. Denise Klugage was an accomplished auto race driver in the mid-50s. She also worked as a journalist of some magazine called Competition Press, which also became, under her leadership, Auto Week, which is today one of America's leading motorsport publications. Not sure if this is politics, but 1983, Elizabeth Dole, Senator Bob Dole's wife, who ran for president once or twice, was the Secretary of Transportation in the Reagan administration. As her highway safety administration, she implemented the third traffic brake light on all cars sold in the U.S. They are probably derogatorily called Liddy lights. Ramsey mentioned earlier now, some 100 years later, has Danica Patrick, who is currently one of the most well-known and talked about female race car drivers in the country. Gone is the day when salesmen spoke to the husband like the wife wasn't there. Now with women currently influencing more than 85% of car sales, of course he, the salesman, may have been replaced by a woman. Since the dawn of the automobiles, we have had many female drivers. Several I've thumbed through their books doing this report. The late Beverly Kimes comes to mind. She was the editor of a big Packard books, basically a Packard Bible. Another one that comes to mind is one that's out in the gift shop, and which I understand is selling out like there's no tomorrow. The Sirens of Chrome talks about the enduring allure of auto show models, taking you from very early on into the 90s. Today they're called product specialists, for a degree in communications and or engineering, and a very good understanding of the product is needed. Volvo, several years ago, had a group of women come in, these basically housewives and the like, and designed the perfect Volvo. And one of the things they came up with is on the headrest, a hole in the back of the headrest for ponytails. I don't know if this ever took effect or not. Looking at our collection, we have a car that has a golf club door in the side. Well, some man somewhere along the way got tired of opening his trunk and said, hey, I want a door in the side, presto. Well, if you look at the minivans today, some woman who was taking kids between school, after school activities, McDonald's, probably screamed enough, and all once we have cup holders in the back that are available for everybody to use, and so it goes. In closing, I'm, as the shirt implies, I'm a volunteer here. If anybody's interested in volunteering, talk to Rusty. Thank you. Have a good evening.